Everybody has hope back there. I don't think if there'd just be a very few that don't. But I don't think there's anybody on death row now that does want to die.
What were the final words, last meals, and execution methods of Florida's death row inmates between 1979 and 2025? Let's delve into the lives and deaths of the 110 individuals executed in Florida during this period. We will reveal their crimes, captures, trials, and the rituals surrounding their executions. John Arthur Spankolink. On February 4, 1973, Spankolink picked up hitchhiker Joseph J. Szymankiewicz at a Tallahassee motel, shot him in the back, and then bludgeoned him with a hatchet after an argument. Investigators recovered both the handgun and the hatchet from an associate's apartment, directly linking him to the killing. He was arrested on February 9, 1973, in Buena Park, California, initially on armed robbery charges, after detectives traced the murder weapon to him. He was then formally charged with first-degree murder. At trial, prosecutors presented forensic analyses and witness testimony placing him at the scene, while the defense claimed self-defense, alleging Szymankiewicz had forced him into Russian roulette and assaulted him. Convicted of first-degree murder in 1973, he was sentenced to death. 2 death warrants, 1977 and 1979, were signed by Governors Askew and Graham, and federal court stays were ultimately overturned. His execution took place on May 25, 1979, in the electric chair known as Old Sparky at Florida State Prison, where 32 witnesses watched 3 1,000-volt surges until he was pronounced dead. Moments before, he declared, "Capital punishment. Them without the capital get the punishment." To his prison minister, he added, "Man is what he chooses to be. He chooses that for himself. I love you."
I didn't think mine would be the first one signed. After it was signed, though, well, it was just something you had to accept. I had a pretty heavy faith in my attorneys, though.
For his final meal, Spankolink requested a single flask of Jack Daniel's whiskey, which he shared with the prison superintendent, Robert Austin Sullivan. On April 8, 1973, Sullivan and his accomplice, Reed McLaughlin, abducted 38-year-old Donald Schmidt, assistant manager of a Howard Johnson's in Homestead, Florida. They taped his hands behind his back, drove him into the Everglades, beat him with a tire iron, and fatally shot him with a shotgun before stealing his watch and credit cards. Arrested April 17, 1973, police found Schmidt's credit cards, his watch, a shotgun, a handgun, tape, and the tire iron in Sullivan's car. He confessed and implicated McLaughlin. Charged with first-degree murder and robbery enhancement, Sullivan faced trial later that year. At trial, the state presented his confession, McLaughlin's testimony, and the recovered evidence. Sullivan later recanted, claiming intoxication and coercion, and that his attorney ignored an alibi at a gay bar. Convicted on November 12, 1973, with a unanimous death recommendation, he saw a clemency plea by Pope John Paul II denied by Governor Graham and all appeals exhausted. He was executed by electrocution at Florida State Prison on November 30, 1983. After Governor Graham confirmed there are no stays at 10:10 a.m., the chair delivered its jolt at 10:16 a.m. under standard witness protocols. His final message to fellow inmates was, "In spite of what is about to happen, do not quit. I hold no malice to none. May God bless us all." His last meal consisted of steak, French fries, a glass of milk, and fresh strawberries. Anthony Anton. On October 23, 1975, he arranged the gangland slaying of Richard Cloud, a former Tampa police detective turned private investigator by contracting 2 hitmen to ambush Cloud as he left his girlfriend's home. Investigators traced the murder weapon and financial records when phone logs and bank statements revealed Anton had provided the gun and paid $1,500 front money and an additional $7,000 after the killing. He was arrested on February 25, 1976, at his Tampa residence after detectives executed search warrants and found address books and documents linking him directly to the hit. Charged with first-degree murder, solicitation, and conspiracy, he was held without bail pending trial. At trial, the state presented wiretapped conversations, the seized address books, and testimony from the hired killers implicating Anton, while the defense argued insufficient direct proof and challenged witness credibility. In March 1980, a jury unanimously recommended death, and the judge imposed the sentence based on aggravating factors including pecuniary gain and prior violent felonies. Anton's appeals on grounds of ineffective counsel, Brady violations, and improper juror exclusion were denied by the Florida Supreme Court, the 11th Circuit, and certiorari was refused by the U.S. Supreme Court. On January 26, 1984, at 7:08 a.m., he was executed via the electric chair at Florida State Prison's Old Sparky before 47 witnesses, with no last-minute stays granted. Moments before the switch was thrown, he paraphrased Christ's words, "Father, forgive them, they know not what they do." For his final meal, he requested and shared with the warden a simple platter of steak, eggs, coffee, and grapefruit. Arthur Frederick Good III. In March 1976, he lured 9-year-old Jason Verdow into the woods near Cape Coral, Florida, where he sexually assaulted and strangled the child, and 10 days later abducted and murdered 11-year-old Kenneth Dawson near Washington, D.C. He was apprehended after a witness recognized the kidnapped boy Billy Arths whom Good had taken, and police secured his confession alongside letters he'd written boasting of his crimes. Tried first in Maryland, he was found sane, convicted of first-degree murder, and given life. Later in Florida, he conducted his own defense, was convicted March 21, 1977, for Verdow's killing, and the jury recommended death. His petition for habeas relief was denied by the Florida Supreme Court, and certiorari was refused by the U.S. Supreme Court in Wainwright v. Good. On April 5, 1984, at 7:03 a.m., the 2,000-volt electric current was applied to his body at Rayford's death chamber, and he was pronounced dead at 7:08 a.m. Strapped into the chair, he tearfully apologized, saying, "I want to apologize to my parents. I have remorse for the 2 boys I murdered. It's difficult for me to show it." For his final meal at 4:45 a.m., he ate steak, a baked potato, buttered cauliflower and broccoli, half a gallon of ice cream, and a dozen chocolate chip cookies, consuming it with gusto, according to prison officials. James Adams. On November 12, 1973, he broke into the Fort Pierce home of millionaire rancher Edgar Brown and beat him to death with a fireplace poker during a foiled robbery attempt. Items stolen from Brown's house were later found in Adams's car, and a neighbor testified to seeing him depart the scene shortly after the killing. He was arrested in St. Lucie County after a traffic stop uncovered Brown's belongings in his vehicle. Charged under Florida Statute Section 782.041A with felony murder, he faced trial for capital murder. Prosecutors relied on the stolen items and witness testimony, while Adams's defense argued he'd been railroaded. Without direct proof, he delivered the fatal blows. A jury convicted him and voted 7-5 in favor of death at sentencing. After state appeals failed, the U.S. Supreme Court lifted a stay by a 5-4 vote, overruling dissenters Marshall and Brennan who cited racial bias in sentencing. On May 10, 1984, he was electrocuted at 7:11 a.m. at Florida State Prison in Rayford, 6 minutes after the chair was activated. Adams maintained his innocence until the end, telling reporters he'd been railroaded, but made no final gurney statement. For his final meal, he ate steak and eggs with a baked potato and drank milk and coffee. Carl Ellson Schreiner. At approximately 6:15 a.m. on October 22, 1976, 32-year-old convenience store clerk Judith Ann Carter was found shot 5 times behind the counter of the Magic Market in Gainesville, Florida. 2 female customers had seen a slender, mustachioed man leave the store alone around 1:30 a.m., and investigators later recovered 3 projectiles at the scene and 2 from Carter's body, all matching a .38 caliber revolver hidden in a nearby residence. Law enforcement issued a BOLO based on composite sketches, and at 4 p.m. on October 23rd, detectives executed a search warrant at 1223 NE 18th Avenue, where they found the revolver. Schreiner was advised of his Miranda rights, waived counsel, and promptly confessed to both the Magic Market murder and an earlier 8-days-in robbery, 90 minutes after the women left the store. He was executed by electric chair at Florida State Prison at 7:12 a.m. on June 20, 1984, with no last-minute stays and approximately 47 witnesses present. After being strapped into the chair, Schreiner read a brief statement from a paper held by the warden but offered no further remarks at the gurney. He ended his life's chapter with a hearty final meal: steak, potatoes, corn on the cob, salad, cantaloupe, strawberries, and ice cream, which he fully consumed before the switch was thrown. David Leroy Washington. During a 10-day spree in September 1976, 34-year-old David Leroy Washington and an accomplice first lured 69-year-old Reverend Daniel Pridgeon into bed, where Washington stabbed him to death while the accomplice held a pillow over Pridgeon's face. 3 days later, they entered Katrina Burke's home, stabbing and killing her and severely wounding others. Finally, on September 29th, they kidnapped 20-year-old Frank Mealy under the guise of a car sale, bound him to a bed, and stabbed him 11 times before burying his body in Washington's backyard. At his December 6th sentencing hearing before Judge Fuller, the prosecution presented victims' families and forensic testimony. Washington's counsel offered no mitigating evidence, waived jury sentencing, and the judge imposed 3 death sentences. On appeal, Washington challenged counsel's performance, but both state and federal courts, including the 11th Circuit and U.S. Supreme Court in Strickland v. Washington, upheld his conviction and sentences throughout 1982 to 1984. On July 13, 1984 at 7:09 a.m., Washington died in Florida's electric chair, holding his 12-year-old daughter on his knee and telling her, "I want you to do better," before turning to the families of his victims. "I'm sorry for all the grief and heartache I brought to them. If my death brings them any satisfaction, so be it." Followed by a message to his fellow inmates: "Don't bow down to defeat without a fight." His final meal comprised fried shrimp, fried oysters, French fries, hot rolls, vanilla ice cream, and lemonade, with an unexpected upgrade to a full pint of ice cream when the half pint he requested proved unavailable. Ernest John Dobert, Jr. In the summer of 1971, Ernest Dobert, Jr. brutally killed his own children in Jacksonville, Florida, strangling 9-year-old Kelly Ann Dobert after repeatedly kicking and choking her, and inflicting fatal injuries on 7-year-old Ryder Scott Dobert, while also torturing his 11-year-old son and abusing his 5-year-old daughter. Prosecutors indicted him in 1974 on 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of child torture. During trial, Dobert's 13-year-old son John III provided chilling eyewitness testimony, describing how his father kicked Kelly multiple times and choked her until she stopped breathing. Despite the jury's 10-2 recommendation for life, Judge Olive overrode them and imposed the death penalty on February 18, 1974. Dobert's convictions and sentences were affirmed by the Florida Supreme Court in June 1976 and by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1977. A Gardner v. Florida violation led to a 1979 resentencing hearing, after which he again received death. Subsequent State Rule 3.850 motions and federal habeas petitions were denied through 1984. He was electrocuted at Florida State Prison on September 7, 1984, calmly accepting his fate with a tight-lipped smile and making no final statement as he sparked the chair. Witnesses describe him winking at his pastor moments before death. Dobert declined any special final meal, refusing the opportunity and spending his last hours in silent reflection. James Dupree Henry. According to official records, 34-year-old James Dupree Henry was executed on September 20, 1984, for the 1979 murder of Orange County Deputy Zelie L. Riley outside a grocery store during a narcotics stakeout. Beyond the execution date, county, and victim listed, detailed case narratives, crime scene reports, trial transcripts, last statements, and final meals were not located in accessible public archives. The sole comprehensive source was the Wikipedia execution list, which did not include offense specifics, evidence summaries, or personal end-of-life details. Timothy Charles Palms. Records list 37-year-old Timothy Charles Palms as executed on November 8, 1984, for the slaying of prison guard James Stone during a 1977 escape attempt from Florida State Prison. Timothy Charles Palms was executed in Florida on November 8, 1984, for the brutal 1976 murder of James Stone, a furniture store owner in Jacksonville. Palms, along with his roommate Ronald Strait and girlfriend Jane Albert, meticulously planned the crime. After the murder, they disposed of the body by dumping the box into the St. John's River and fled to California, where they were eventually apprehended. During his trial, Palmas attempted to shift blame onto Albert, claiming his involvement was limited to disposing of the body. However, his confession, obtained after he waived his right to counsel, played a significant role in his conviction. The Florida Supreme Court upheld his death sentence, and subsequent appeals, including those to federal courts, were unsuccessful. Palmas was the 10th person executed in Florida following the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. His execution by electrocution was marked by his calm demeanor. His final words were, "My family's love has been my strength. That's all. Goodbye." James David Rollerson. James David Rollerson was convicted of gunning down Jacksonville police officer Michael Stewart, age 23, during a restaurant robbery on April 27, 1975, when he shot Stewart multiple times at close range as the officer and his partner responded to a robbery and sexual battery call at a Jacksonville Atlantic Boulevard restaurant. Ballistic analysis matched bullets recovered from Stewart's body to Rollerson's weapon, and survivor testimony from Stewart's partner placed Rollerson at the scene, leading to his arrest later that day after he was wounded in the shootout and identified by witnesses. At trial, the prosecution presented forensic evidence, including matching gunshot residue and ballistic trajectories, as well as the partner's eyewitness testimony, while the defense argued Stewart may have been struck by a stray police bullet during the crossfire. A Duval County jury found him guilty of first-degree murder on June 3, 1976, voting unanimously 12-0 to recommend death, and Judge Moore formally sentenced him on June 10, 1976, before the Florida Supreme Court affirmed the conviction in 1978, and the U.S. Supreme Court denied certiorari in early 1985. Rollerson's final appeals, including a last-minute petition to the U.S. Supreme Court, were rejected on January 29, 1985, clearing the way for his execution at Florida State Prison by electric chair at 7:11 a.m. on January 30, 1985, witnessed by Stewart's father among other law enforcement family members. In his last moments, Rowlerson protested his innocence, telling witnesses, "A stray police bullet killed a rookie Jacksonville police officer," then offered no other closing remarks before the switch was thrown. He did not request a special final meal and spent his final hours without a formal last dinner, declining any last meal request offered by prison staff. John Paul Wit. John Paul Wit, age 42, abducted 11-year-old Jonathan Mark Kushner on October 28, 1973, from a neighborhood convenience store in Tampa, Florida, then sexually assaulted and murdered him, later dumping his body in a wooded area where it was discovered 3 days later. Investigators linked Wit to the crime through forensic analysis of fibers found on Kushner's clothing and eyewitness tip-offs from a real estate agent who recognized his car near the discovery site, leading to his arrest on October 31, 1973, when he was found at a Tampa boarding house. He was charged with first-degree murder and kidnapping. At his 1975 trial in Hillsborough County, the prosecution called forensic experts to match tire tracks and fibers alongside the boy's mother's testimony, while the defense argued mental instability and sought an insanity plea. The jury rejected these defenses and returned a 10-2 verdict in favor of guilt, recommending death, which Judge Behuniak imposed on March 15, 1976. Witt's appeals reached the Florida Supreme Court, affirmed 1977, and the U.S. Supreme Court, Wainwright v. Witt, 469, U.S. 412, 1985, which upheld his death sentence, and his final petition for clemency was denied by Governor Bob Graham in early 1985. On March 6, 1985, at 7:10 a.m., Witt was strapped into Florida's Old Sparky at the state prison in Rayford, Florida, and executed by electric chair without last-minute stays, attended by journalists, officials, and prison staff. He made no formal final statement on the gurney, remaining silent as the current was applied, though he maintained his innocence with a final glance at the warden before the electrodes were activated. Witt did not select a special last meal, declining the offer of any menu beyond the standard prison fare served earlier that morning. Marvin Francois. Marvin Francois, age 39, participated in the Carroll City murders, a series of execution-style killings, culminating on July 27, 1977, when he and accomplices bound and shot 6 people in a Carroll City drug house, leaving 2 survivors among the 8 attacked. Police traced Francois through testimony of an accomplice turned informant, Buford White, who identified him in a lineup. After multiple tips, detectives executed a warrant on January 5, 1980, arresting Francois at a Miami apartment and seizing firearms matching those used in the killings. At his 1981 trial in Miami-Dade County, the prosecution presented ballistics matching recovered weapons, surviving victims' identifications, and the informant's testimony, while the defense unsuccessfully argued diminished capacity. The jury unanimously convicted him on 6 counts of first-degree murder on June 15, 1984, and recommended death, which Judge Smith imposed accordingly. Francois' appeals, including state post-conviction motions for ineffective assistance of counsel and federal habeas petitions, were denied by both the Florida Supreme Court, 1985, and the 11th Circuit, and the U.S. Supreme Court declined review later that year. On May 29, 1985, at 6 a.m., he was electrocuted in the electric chair at Florida State Prison, marking the last electrocution in Miami-Dade County. No final stays were granted, and victims' families and press witnessed the execution. Francois offered no last words as he was strapped into the chair, remaining silent until the fatal surge. He declined any special final meal request, instead eating only the standard Daniel Morris Thomas. Daniel Morris Thomas, age 37, invaded the rural Polk County home of University of Florida Associate Professor Charles Anderson on January 1, 1976, during a violent robbery in which he shot Anderson 5 times, raped the professor's wife as the dying Anderson lay in a pool of blood, then shot the couple's dog in front of the children. Law enforcement linked Thomas to the crime when an informant reported selling stolen handguns, one matching the ballistics from Anderson's murder, to Thomas and his neighbor, prompting a search warrant that uncovered the revolver, ski masks, and personal items taken from the Anderson residence on December 21, 1976, leading to his arrest that same day. At trial in Polk County Circuit Court, the prosecution presented ballistic matching, the informant's testimony, and forensic analysis of ski mask fibers, while the defense called no witnesses, arguing Thomas's refusal to cooperate stemmed from mental anguish. The jury convicted him on April 15, 1977, and unanimously recommended the death penalty, which Judge Duncan formalized the next day. Thomas's appeals, including direct appeal, affirmed by Florida Supreme Court in 1979, state post-conviction petitions, and a 1985 federal habeas challenge were all denied, and the U.S. Supreme Court refused to grant certiorari before his execution. On April 15, 1986 at 12:19 p.m., Thomas was executed by electric chair at Florida State Prison, crying out and resisting as guards strapped him in. The procedure began just 24 minutes after the Supreme Court refused further stays. He uttered no coherent final statement, his only audible words lost amid his screams and the clanging of shackles as the current was applied. Thomas did not request a special final meal and spent his final hours without a formal last meal beyond prison provisions. David Livingston Funess. David Livingston Funess, a 39-year-old Vietnam War veteran, slashed the throats of lounge owner Anna Waldrop and patron Clayton Reagan, both in their 50s, during a robbery at his former Jacksonville bar on December 16, 1974, and fatally stabbed 62-year-old Bertha McLeod 2 hours later, who died in 1977 from complications. On April 22, 1986 at 5:11 p.m., Funess was executed by electric chair at Florida State Prison, pinning him to the wooden Old Sparky gurney as the current surged, witnessed by his wife, siblings, and a handful of Vietnam veterans protesting his treatment. As the switch was thrown, he mouthed, "I love you," to his attorney but spoke no verbal last words, instead offering a final nod to familiar faces in the witness room. For his final meal, Funess requested a hamburger, French fries, a malted milkshake, and coffee, which he fully consumed before the execution was carried out. Ronald John Michael Strait. On October 4, 1976, Strait stabbed Jacksonville businessman James N. Stone to death during a planned robbery at Stone's furniture store, inflicting fatal wounds with a knife as he attempted to extort money for personal gain. Investigators recovered the murder weapon and materials used to construct a weighted coffin in Strait's Duval County apartment. Ballistics and fiber analysis linked the knife and lumber to the crime scene. He was arrested 2 days later, charged with first-degree murder, and held without bail. At his 1977 trial, the prosecution presented his in-court confession, forensic knife analysis, and eyewitness testimony, while the defense argued self-defense and challenged the voluntariness of his statements. A jury convicted him and unanimously recommended death. The judge imposed the sentence based on aggravating factors including pecuniary gain and prior violent felony convictions. Post-conviction appeals on ineffective counsel and Brady violation grounds were denied by Florida's highest court and the 11th Circuit. Strait was electrocuted at 7:12 a.m. on May 20, 1986, at Florida State Prison's electric chair, Old Sparky, with no further stays of execution. He refused a final meal and made no statement on the gurney, instead remaining silent as the current was applied. Buford White. On July 27, 1977, White participated in the Carroll City Massacre, entering a suburban Miami drug house and, alongside co-defendant John Errol Ferguson, blindfolding, binding, and shooting 6 victims execution style at point-blank range. Surviving victims' testimonies and ballistic matches to his seized handgun led to his arrest on September 2, 1977, at a motel in Miami-Dade County. He was indicted on 6 counts of first-degree murder and related charges. During his 1981 Miami-Dade trial, prosecutors offered informant testimony, survivor identifications, and forensic evidence. The defense sought an insanity plea, presenting psychiatric evaluations that the jury ultimately rejected. The jury returned guilty verdicts and unanimously recommended death based on aggravators of pecuniary gain and multiple violent felonies. A judge formalized the sentence shortly thereafter. White's conviction and death sentence were affirmed by the Florida Supreme Court in 1983, and the U.S. Supreme Court denied certiorari in 1984. He was executed via electric chair on August 28, 1987, before 18 witnesses. He declined any special final meal and issued no last words. Willie Jasper Darden. On September 8, 1973, Darden shot 54-year-old James Carl Turman multiple times during an attempted robbery at Turman's Lakeland, Florida furniture store. Turman died instantly, and Darden fled the scene. Fingerprint and ballistic evidence tied Darden to the crime, and he was arrested later that day on a traffic violation, then charged with first-degree murder and armed robbery. At his January 1974 Citrus County trial, prosecutors presented eyewitness identifications and forensic ballistics, while defense attorneys offered alibi testimony which the jury found unpersuasive. The jury recommended death, and the judge followed suit. After 14 years on death row, amid worldwide protests over jury racial composition and multiple signed death warrants, Darden was electrocuted on March 15, 1988, at Florida State Prison. His final meal requests and last-word statements are not documented in public records. Jeffrey Joseph Doggery. In early 1976, Doggery embarked on a multi-state killing spree, culminating in the March 1st abduction and stabbing murder of hitchhiker LaVon Patricia Saylor in Brevard County. He had lured her into his car and stabbed her 5 times before abandoning her body near a dump site. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, robbery, and kidnapping in November 1980, providing an in-court confession. The sentencing phase jury then unanimously recommended death based on aggravating factors of pecuniary gain and prior violent felony convictions. Under law, the judge formally imposed death in April 1981. Doherty's appeals, including claims of coerced plea and ineffective counsel, were denied by the Florida Supreme Court in 1982 and by the U.S. Supreme Court later that year. On November 7, 1988, he was electrocuted in Florida's electric chair at 5:02 p.m., making a 6-minute final statement condemning the death penalty system as unjust before the current was applied. Public records do not specify any special last meal request, suggesting he ate only the standard prison fare. Theodore Robert Bundy. Ted Bundy, already convicted in multiple states for murder and sexual assault, kidnapped 12-year-old Kimberly Leach from a Lake City school on February 9, 1978. He murdered her by bludgeoning and strangulation, then concealed her body in a wooded area 30 miles west of her home. Arrested on February 15, 1978, he faced a Florida capital trial in Columbia County. Prosecutors presented bite mark analysis, eyewitness testimony, and his own incriminating boasted confessions, while the defense attacked the scientific reliability of the bite marks. A jury found him guilty on July 24, 1979, and recommended death. The sentence was imposed the next day, upheld by Florida's Supreme Court in 1980, and certiorari was denied by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1981. Bundy endured 8 years of stays before Governor Graham signed the final warrant. He was executed by electric chair at 7:16 a.m. on January 24, 1989, at Florida State Prison, calmly requesting that his love be conveyed to family in a brief final statement. His last meal, steak, eggs, hash browns, wheat toast, and coffee, was consumed heartily, with Bundy smiling as he shared the toast with a guard. So, this is the end of Part 1. We will be covering the remaining parts in Part 2. Stay tuned with us, and please do not forget to subscribe to the channel.